Mencer. He's the former director of Labor Friends of Israel. But first, let's go to journalist Ali Barrett, who is, we could see in London, outside the Houses of Parliament. And now to give us a sense of the mood there in the British capital on this decisive day.
Well, there's been a bit of a carnival mood around Westminster, demonstrations and counter-demonstrations taking place here. Those in favour of a people's vote, another referendum, and those who say Brexit needs to be followed through on. Now, most of the time, those demonstrations, those counter-demonstrations have been good-natured. There have been some nasty words thrown in either direction as well, and some nasty words thrown at journalists around the compound here at Westminster too, although no tears from us here, but certainly it gives you a sense of how divisive Brexit remains in terms of the public mood here in the UK. In terms of MPs, they are getting ready for what is a historic vote, but they probably know the result already.
Well, of course, you're implying the defeat for Theresa May. What are the chances, if that does happen, Ali, that will move ahead to the so-called cliff edge of a no-deal Brexit on March 29th, that deadline that's approaching?
It's a very real possibility because at the moment it is the default legal scenario. Legislation has been passed here previously, which means that Britain comes out of the European Union on the 29th of March unless some other plan is put in place before then. And the problem that the House of Commons has at the moment, and opponents of Brexit have at the moment, is that there is no majority inside there for anything really at the moment. So coalescing around some kind of alternative is very difficult indeed. So Theresa May has been saying all along, if her deal doesn't pass, then she believes there will either be no deal or that other possibility of no Brexit at all. But as I say, the default scenario as we stand is no deal if Theresa May's agreement isn't passed, because doing something like extending Article 50, putting off Brexit, is more complicated than it sounds.
David, give us a sense of your friends and I presume family in the UK. Even those that supported Brexit, has this been more than they bargained for?
A lot more. I mean, this debate now has gone on for 2.5 years since the referendum, probably 6 months before that, when during the run-up to the referendum. And don't forget, I was in meetings almost 25 years ago with John Major, the former Prime Minister, and he used to tell me, and people in that room that time, he used to say that the EU is coming down the line to gobble up the Conservative Party, and his words have proved to be right. This issue will not go away. Now, don't forget that 17.1 million people voted for it. Something like 16 million people voted against it. There is a clear majority to make it happen. But unfortunately, with Theresa May being the leader of the Conservative Party, no one, literally no one in the country is getting anything which they wanted. It's a fudge, it's a bad deal. And the people that just want to leave the EU, which is what they actually voted for, they just want to leave the EU. They are not getting what they want. So, unfortunately, it's made it a very divisive Britain right now.
Well, Ali, as you heard perhaps from our guest, the divisive issue, Theresa May, not really satisfying either camp. Is there a sense here that her political career, at least as the Prime Minister, could be coming to an end with this vote?
It could well be. Jeremy Corbyn, the opposition Labour leader, has promised to table a no-confidence vote in the Commons soon after Theresa May is defeated, if that's indeed what happens. Now, that may not unseat her, but it's possible if she faces a really, really heavy defeat here, that her own cabinet could say, look, Mrs May, you've had enough, you've had your go, you didn't succeed in getting a plan through the Commons, we have to try another tack now.
All right, Ali, a beautiful view of the Houses of Parliament behind you, but looking a lot less pretty perhaps right now inside the Commons. Ali Barrett there in London. Thank you for that. Well, until now, we have been focusing on the British side of Brexit, but of course the European Union also has a tremendous amount of stake in a decision that could see it lose as a member its second biggest economy. Our senior international affairs correspondent, Owen Alterman, goes back in history to look at the fraught relationship between the UK and the EU.
It was after World War II, and Britain's iconic former leader supported the idea of a European club.
We hope to see a Europe where men of every country will think as much of being a European and to belonging to their native land.
It took a while for Britain to join the emerging Europe.
Well, actually, I think it'll be a good thing. Well, I think it's okay if it's worked properly.
In the 1960s, Britain's application was rejected, vetoed twice by then French President Charles de Gaulle, who didn't want an Anglo-American axis to have sway. In 1973, Britain did join what was then the European Economic Community. Not that everyone in Britain was happy about it. In 1975, British voters went to the polls for a referendum. 41 years before Brexit, they too decided in or out of Europe. In that vote, the in side won. Britain stayed, but the issue lingered.
Every time there was a discussion whether or not to delegate power to common institutions such as the European Parliament or European Commission, Britain was always against it. Somehow they believed that the British Parliament defends the interests of the British people more than any other institution.
There were ups and downs in the 1980s and 90s. Then, in 2004, what had become the European Union began to expand into Eastern Europe. Hundreds of thousands of Poles, Romanians, and others moved across the channel looking for work.
The relationship between the UK and the EU, they were always very complicated. The UK never joined the EU coin, the euro. She kept her pound. And there was a lot of issues that the UK wanted to be apart.
In Britain's Conservative Party, opposition to the EU festered. That led then Prime Minister David Cameron to put Brexit on the ballot. On June 23, 2016, British voters had their say, leaving British and European leaders to figure out how to set the terms of divorce. Owen Alterman, I-24 News.
Let's go to Paris now and our senior diplomatic correspondent in Europe, Christian Millard. And Christian, give us a sense of how this scenario playing out in London is being viewed from European capitals, EU capitals like Paris, like Berlin, and of course Brussels.
Well, I talked today to some representatives, very close collaborators to French Minister of Foreign Affairs Jean-Yves Le Drian. I would say the people inside the Union and even in France are not panic-stricken. They just feel nervous about the issue, the unknown, with many questions about the coming future. I would say that they were very tough. Qualifying the British parliamentary politics as violent and complicated, did they tell me on the phone today. And they said, our major preoccupation now is to find out what the consequences we will face in case of a hard Brexit or in case that the British want a new version of the Brexit. We need to make a list, did they say, of judiciary impact in case of hard Brexit. And then comes a lot of questions. What happens if we don't have any agreement? We had specific agreements. What happens if there are no more rules? What about the Brits in France? What about the 330,000 French living in Great Britain? What happened about merchandises in the harbour, in the airport, seas of payment, security, transportation, legal body is very huge. They ask a tremendous lot of questions with no answer. And I think the unknown makes them worried about what's coming up.
Well, certainly a lot of unanswered questions there. Christian, let me ask you, there were reports today in the press of European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker supposedly clearing his schedule for the next few days, perhaps preparing to negotiate or renegotiate with Prime Minister May if she loses this vote. Now, the EU has taken a tough line into now saying no renegotiation. Is it possible that may change?
Well, it's difficult to say right now the position of EU and Jean-Claude Juncker and Donald Tusk is the tough line, as you alluded to. And I have not heard about any change in the mood of Jean-Claude Juncker in the coming past. But if the situation comes so difficult for the coming future and it's going to be tough for the most of the European countries, the 27 of the EU on the line, I think they might try to find new options. It's still possible. But I have not got any information going that way.
Okay, Christian Millard there in Paris. Thank you for that report. And David, I don't want to go into the complexities of this deal. There is some question being raised, specifically about the Irish border question, which some believe could call into question UK sovereignty over Northern Ireland. But let me ask you, even if Jean-Claude Juncker would give way on some of these issues, maybe extend the transition period or loosen some of the restrictions, would that help, or is it at this stage, Theresa May and her whatever Brexit plan is just bad goods for the British public?
Look, I tell you what this fundamentally comes down to. You have a fundamental mismatch between Jean-Claude Juncker and the way that he negotiates in Europe, and that is giving in very, very little, and the British way of negotiating. Now, the British are negotiating like gentlemen, going into negotiations in a respectful way, not in a haughty way, and trying to get the best deal. Now, that has completely failed, if I may say so. Perhaps Britain's negotiators to take a leaf out of Israeli negotiators and go in there a lot tougher and a lot stronger and a lot more certain of their case, because at the end of the day, Britain is a great market for European produce, and if BMW want to sell their cars to the British middle classes and the French wine manufacturers want to sell their wine to the British drinkers, which they do, then Britain is a very strong economy. It should negotiate in a much, much stronger way. This gentlemanly act, which the British are doing currently in negotiations with negotiators, hasn't worked. It just hasn't worked.
Let me play devil's advocate or EU advocate, as it were, here. Isn't there a tremendous amount at stake here for the EU if it allows Britain to go out, in a sense, in a less painful Brexit? It's creating a dangerous precedent for other nations. The EU, we know, is in a sense could be fighting for its life with these rise of populist governments, for example, in Italy, that may be less friendly to the EU. The EU has to negotiate tough so that Britain does not create an avalanche of departures.
Look, the fact of the matter is that EU's economies are failing. Germany is about to go into recession. The French civil society is completely in unrest. The euro is not a strong currency. The EU is not in a strong way, and of course always negotiates hard with Britain. Britain's mistake is to act as a gentleman. It should go in much, much tougher. It should really stand its ground and take it right to the wire. And I think that's why this hard Brexit is not a bad idea as things stand right now.
David, let's take a look now at the House of Commons, where British Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn is speaking.
Failing to publish their legal advice. Yes. Then, for the first time in a generation or more, on the 10th of December, a government failed to move its own business in the House. The government has been defeated on a vote in its own finance bill for the first time since the 1970s. The Prime Minister opened the debate on her deal more than 1 month ago, a debate that was due to end on the 11th of December, but she pulled it in a panic. As she herself conceded, it would have been rejected by a significant margin. She has run down the clock in a cynical attempt to strong-arm members into backing her deal. Despite her promises, she's failed to negotiate any changes to her deal with Europe. No wonder the Prime Minister has suddenly discovered the importance of trade unions. She voted to clip their wings in the 2016 Trade Union Act, and she's utterly failed to convince them she has anything to offer Britain's workforce. And this, Mr. Speaker, is the heart of the matter. The Prime Minister has treated Brexit as a matter for the Conservative Party rather than the good of the country. But she's failed to win over even her own party. Many Conservative members who voted Remain are opposed to this deal, as are dozens of Conservative members who voted Leave. After losing her majority in the 2017 general election, the Prime Minister could have engaged with members across this House. She could have listened to the voices of trade unions. And if she had been listening, Both businesses and trade unions would have told her they wanted a comprehensive and permanent customs union to secure jobs and trade. The decision to rule out a new customs union with a British say and the lack of certainty in the deal risks business investment being deferred on an even greater scale, threatening jobs and threatening living standards. Or even worse, it risks many companies relocating abroad, taking jobs and investment with them. Mr. Speaker, many workers know exactly this situation because they are facing this reality now. Their jobs are at risk, and they know their jobs are at risk. Both the First Ministers of Wales and Scotland have also made clear to the Prime Minister their support for a customs union.
And we've just been listening to Jeremy Corbyn, head of the Labour opposition there in the House of Commons, ahead of the vote later this evening on Theresa May's Brexit plan. And David Mencer, Jeremy Corbyn basically saying Prime Minister May could have cut a deal with Labour on a sort of middle ground between Brexit and sort of staying in at least the customs union of the EU, keeping the same tariffs. Is that realistic? Is that a viable position that Jeremy Corbyn's actually putting out there?
Look, take a look at this for a moment. Jeremy Corbyn is leading the opposition and the opposition to the government. The government is in daily crisis. It makes Israel's government look strong and stable and consistent. The government is in daily crisis, yet he is actually below Theresa May in the polls. He should be streets ahead. He should be streaming ahead. Any decent leader of Her Majesty's opposition would be streets ahead in the polls, but he hasn't actually captured the public mood. His currency is chaos. That's what all Marxists like, actually. They want the economy to collapse. That is part of their overall strategy. So the pound sinking further and further on the international currencies, financial markets in turmoil, that is his currency, his preferred currency. So whatever he says right now, he's right on the analysis. The government is actually chaos, but he has not capitalized on that. He is barely.
And yet polls don't rule out, of course, like you said, he should be streaking ahead, but polls do not rule out the possibility that if this Conservative government collapses, he could become the Prime Minister.
Absolutely, absolutely. A further sorry state of affairs, which unfortunately I put the blame squarely at Theresa May. She took on the job to negotiate Brexit. She said that Brexit means Brexit. She said that no deal was better than a bad deal, and she has gone against every single one of those comments. She has gone cap in hand, weak and divided to the EU, and the EU have capitalised upon that and have given her a really, really tough deal that she cannot sell at home because 17.1 million people said they wanted to leave, not this sort of, light pseudo-leaving where actually they're staying within the EU, still paying the dues, which the EU are happy to gobble up, but not getting any of the benefits of leaving.
Okay, David Mencer, of the former director of Labour Friends from Israel.